This is the brief on breaking the C1 English listening plateau. If you understand subtitles perfectly but feel totally lost in fast, natural conversations, well, this masterclass reveals how to stop listening for literal words and start decoding the hidden subtext, cultural codes, and kind of chaotic grammar of native fluency. First, you got to shift from just processing literal sound to processing psychology. Native speakers use tone and hesitation to mean the exact opposite of what they're saying, like using a totally deadpan delivery for sarcasm. Think of the literal words as the lyrics to a song, but the tone is the sheet music. To really understand someone, you have to read that sheet music, because if the tone ever contradicts the words, the tone is absolutely always telling the truth. Second, because of this underlying psychology, you've got to master the hidden lexicon. People rarely say exactly what they mean in high-stakes situations. They use polite phrases to soften the blow, like saying, "Wow, that's an interesting perspective," when they actually mean it's a terrible idea. So are you still translating every single word, or are you ready to absorb these phrases as emotional signals of an insider? Finally, you have to embrace the messy, spoken syntax of real-time speech. Textbook grammar is just a pristine map, but real speech is the messy, actual territory. To uncover your phonetic blind spots, try microtranscription. Literally write down exactly what you hear in a short clip, including every single and blended sound like whatcha. Mastering advanced English isn't just an academic drill, it's an act of deep empathy, where you stop fighting the speed and start tuning into the beautiful chaos of human connection.
Welcome to Daily English Flow. Stay until the end for a special bonus tip. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Have you ever had one of those moments where you're sitting in a meeting, maybe it's a high-stakes business presentation or something,
Oh, yeah.
or even you're just watching a critically acclaimed movie without the subtitles on, and you understand every single word they're saying. Like, the grammar makes perfect sense in your head.
Right. You know all the vocabulary.
Exactly. But then the whole room bursts out laughing and you realize you completely missed the joke.
Oh, it is an incredibly isolating feeling. Or, when you're listening to a native speaker and they're just going at absolute full speed.
Yeah, using idioms and...
Yeah, using idioms and blending all their words together.
Yeah.
And you get that distinct sensation that your brain is just buffering.
Yes. Buffering. That is the perfect word for it.
It feels like an old computer trying to render a massive 4K video file, and your mental RAM is just completely maxed out. You're desperately trying to translate the audio before the next sentence hits you.
You can almost feel the gears grinding in your head. It's so exhausting. And if you felt that, as a listener, you are definitely not alone.
No, not at all.
That is exactly what we are focusing on today. We've got a really fascinating set of sources that outline a masterclass on something they call the C1 listening plateau. And the mission of this deep dive is to figure out how to actually break through that wall. We want to move from just processing the physical sound of a language to processing the psychology behind it.
Right, which is a huge leap.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is this brutal truth about advanced English that our sources are hitting us with right out of the gate?
Well, the brutal truth is really a fundamental shift in what listening actually is.
Yeah.
Because at the intermediate stage, the B2 level, your entire goal was just learning to understand what people are saying.
You're just mapping physical sound to a dictionary definition, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But at the advanced level at C1, the rules just change entirely. You have to understand why they're saying it,
right,
how they feel about it, and crucially, what they are purposefully leaving unsaid.
Because native speakers don't talk in those perfect isolated textbook sentences, right? Like, they just don't.
Never. The sources actually estimate that if you are only listening to the literal dictionary definition of the words, you're missing a staggering 50% of the actual message.
Yeah, 50%. So half the conversation is just gone.
Gone. You're completely blind to the irony that they might use to soften a blow, or the understatement masking this massive frustration.
So you're listening for pure information when you should be listening for nuance or subtext.
Subtext, cultural delay, all of that. It requires a complete paradigm shift in how your auditory cortex is actually filtering the data. To catch that invisible layer of spoken English, you really have to start listening to the negative space.
The negative space. Okay, I like that. So this is the psychology of sound we're talking about.
Right. Native speakers use these really subtle shifts in tone and pitch and pacing to convey meanings that sometimes actively contradict their literal words.
Right, like with sarcasm or polite indirectness. Our sources actually highlight this classic example of a British person looking outside and saying, it's a bit chilly.
Yes. Which, if you're relying on a dictionary, translates to, oh, maybe grab a light sweater.
Right. But within that specific cultural context, it often means we are in the middle of a freezing blizzard, and we might actually not survive the journey to the store.
Exactly. The understatement itself is the entire point of the communication. The literal words are almost irrelevant there. You really have to train your ear to detect these emotional micro-expressions in the voice.
So how does that sound, like structurally?
Well, when someone is being sarcastic, for example, they often use a deadpan delivery.
Yeah.
So a flat, slightly elongated pitch with almost no emotional variation. The tone actively contradicts the words.
And when they contradict, the tone is always the one telling the truth.
Always.
You know, that concept, it actually reminds me of looking at a famous logo, like the FedEx logo.
Oh, yeah, the hidden arrow.
Yeah, for years, you just look at it and you just see the literal letters. You see F-E-D-E-X, and then one day someone points out the hidden arrow formed in the negative space between the E and the X.
Right, and then you can't unsee it.
Exactly. Once you see that hidden arrow, it's there forever, it sounds like. Once you know to listen for that hidden emotional arrow in the tone, you can't unhear it.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
You are literally training your brain's pattern recognition to lock on to a completely new set of signals. Yeah. And the sources offer some really intensely practical strategies to build this cognitive flexibility for your ear.
Okay, let's get into those because I definitely need them.
So the first one is what they call the accent immersion sprint.
Okay, I was reading the section on the accent immersion sprint, and honestly, initially it sounded like a form of self-inflicted torture.
It kind of is at first.
Yeah, because the idea is that for 7 straight days, you listen exclusively to one highly challenging accent.
Right.
So maybe you only watch Scottish comedies, or you only listen to Australian podcasts and you don't switch for a week.
Yeah, you have to stick with it. And the science behind that approach is fascinating because it forces a physical recalibration.
Okay, how so?
Well, your brain's phonetic decoder relies on predictive models.
Yeah.
Right? When you listen to an unfamiliar accent, those predictive models just fail.
Which is why it feels so exhausting to listen to it.
Exactly. But by refusing to switch inputs for 7 days, you give your auditory cortex no choice but to adjust to the new vowel sounds and the new rhythmic cadence. You stop fighting the unfamiliarity, and your neural pathways start recognizing the underlying patterns.
And then what happens after the 7 days?
Well, when you switch to a new accent, or even back to a standard one, your brain has built immense phonetic resilience. It just handles variation so much better.
The logic is undeniable. But when dealing with the sheer speed of native speakers, like not just the accent, but the speed, the sources suggest a strategy that seems totally paradoxical at first glance.
The 1.25x speed bridge.
Yes, because if normal native speed feels overwhelming, your instinct obviously tells you to slow the audio down to like 0.8x, right?
Naturally.
But the strategy dictates the exact opposite. You listen to a podcast at 1.25x speed for just 10 minutes a day.
Right. And that paradox is actually the core of the method, because it addresses why you are buffering in the first place.
The translation buffer.
Exactly. You're buffering because you are holding words in this mental translation buffer. You hear the English phrase, you translate it back to your native language in your head, you process the meaning, and then you try to jump back out to catch up with the audio.
Which is exhausting.
It is.
Yeah.
And working memory has a strict capacity limit. You physically cannot maintain that translation process at 1.25x speed. Your brain just crashes.
No, you are intentionally overloading the system. You're breaking the habit on purpose.
You're forcing the brain to abandon the translation buffer entirely. It has to drop the middleman and start processing meaning intuitively and instantly. It's really an exercise in cognitive survival.
Wow.
And when you drop the audio back down to normal speed, after 10 minutes of that extreme overload, regular native speech suddenly feels incredibly slow.
And crystal clear because that bottleneck of translation has been removed.
Exactly.
It's essentially like putting your brain on a treadmill cranked up to the absolute maximum incline. So when you finally walk on solid ground, it feels completely effortless.
It's resistance training for your ears.
But if you're training your ear to catch these micro expressions at high speed, that has to influence how you actually produce the language yourself, right? Like the sources mention that you cannot produce a nuance you haven't internalized.
That is a fundamental rule of linguistics. You can't speak with advanced subtlety if your ears haven't absorbed the data first. At the C1 level, the goal of speaking isn't just making yourself understood anymore.
Right, you're past that.
Yeah, it's achieving what linguists call pragmatic competence.
Pragmatic competence. Okay, in a real-world scenario, that essentially means social navigation, doesn't it?
Pretty much. It's the ability to sound polite without sounding weak or sounding urgent without coming across as aggressive.
Right, you learn to soften requests. You use pitch to signal hesitation or employ back channeling. You know, those little... And yeah, sounds to show empathy.
Yeah, it is essentially the acoustic manifestation of emotional intelligence.
I have to push back on this a little bit, though, because when I was reading about pragmatic competence, it started to feel a little bit like social camouflage. Wait, is this basically just learning how to lie politely? Are we just learning the socially acceptable ways to fake our intentions in English?
I mean, that is a cynical yet completely understandable interpretation. It can definitely feel manipulative at first.
It really does.
But it's less about lying and much more about managing social friction. It's recognizing that blunt directness can be perceived as an act of attack in certain cultures.
Right, okay.
So to navigate that friction, the source suggests a technique called the pragmatic shadow.
The pragmatic shadow, how does that work?
You find a short clip of a native speaker navigating a tricky social situation. So like refusing a wedding invitation or delivering bad news to a client.
So you don't just study what they say, you study the actual mechanics of how they soften the blow.
Right. You shadow the clip, you mimic it out loud, but crucially, you do not just copy the words. You mimic the exact pitch, the gentle delivery, the slight hesitant pause before they say, you know, I'm afraid I won't be able to make it.
Right. Their voice usually goes slightly higher and noticeably softer in those moments.
Exactly. And by mimicking that exact musicality, you are downloading that pragmatic competence directly into your own vocal cords. You're actively learning the acoustic cues of cooperation.
That's fascinating. And if we are mirroring their pitch to navigate that social friction and maintain harmony, it makes sense that the vocabulary they choose is doing similar heavy lifting.
Absolutely.
The literal definitions just aren't enough to carry that much unspoken weight.
This is where we enter what the sources call the hidden lexicon. Because even the vocabulary changes its function at this advanced level. Native speakers rely heavily on 3 pillars of vocabulary, where they almost never say exactly what they mean.
And those are euphemism, idiomatic, banter, and cultural codes.
Right.
The euphemism pillar is just instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever worked in a corporate environment.
Oh, yeah. It's the art of corporate spin, right?
It is, wrapping a harsh reality in soft, abstract vocabulary. So instead of saying civilian deaths, the military says collateral damage.
Right.
Or instead of a manager saying you are fundamentally wrong and I'm ending this argument, they just say let's agree to disagree.
Which is such a classic.
Or responding to a terrible idea in a brainstorming session with, that's an interesting perspective.
Right, because it allows people to disagree without declaring war, basically.
Yeah.
And then you have idiomatic banter, which is less about spin and more about social shorthand.
Right, like phrases like read the room or throw someone under the bus.
Exactly. You can't translate those literally. If you do, it sounds absurd. You have to absorb them as single cohesive units of emotion.
Okay, and the third pillar, cultural codes, that feels like the deepest layer of the lexicon.
It really is. This involves using literary or historical references, like calling a situation a catch-22 or describing a bureaucratic nightmare as Kafkaesque.
Catch-22 being the novel where you're trapped by contradictory rules.
Right. And Kafkaesque refers to Franz Kafka's work, where the system is just completely surreal and oppressive.
And if you don't know the book or the author, you are just completely locked out of the conversation.
You are. What's fascinating here is that when you understand these codes, you undergo a really profound psychological shift. You elevate from being a language learner who is just deciphering individual words to a culturally fluent insider.
Right, because a native speaker uses a reference like Kafkaesque to signal that they assume you share their background and their worldview.
Exactly. When you catch the reference and smile, you're officially in the club.
And because the vocabulary is carrying so much unspoken weight and cultural coding, it feels like traditional, rigid textbook grammar simply can't keep up with that psychological pacing.
It can't.
The structure itself has to adapt to carry that much subtext, which brings us to the concept of spoken syntax.
Right. Real-time native speech purposefully breaks textbook rules for the sake of efficiency and emotional impact. It is a completely different operating system than written grammar.
It reminds me of the difference between learning to read sheet music in a really quiet classroom and then walking into a live jazz club.
Well, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like the textbook grammar is the sheet music. It is mathematically perfect, every note is accounted for, and it is entirely predictable. But spoken syntax is the jazz. The musicians are improvising live, they're intentionally dropping notes, they are breaking the formal rules on purpose just to manage the cognitive flow and keep the conversational groove going.
That analogy captures the mechanics perfectly. Spoken syntax is literally the grammar of emotion and cognitive management. For instance, they use a technique called ellipsis, which is the art of dropping structural words.
Like omitting things that are technically required by grammar rules?
Exactly. So instead of saying the grammatically complete, do you want to go to the store, a native speaker just says, want to go.
Right. They delete the subject and the auxiliary verb because the context makes it completely obvious.
Yeah, and if your brain is waiting to hear the full grammatical structure before processing the meaning, you fall behind the beat of the jazz.
Still processing do you want to while they're already out the door.
Right.
And then they do this thing where they just abandon a sentence entirely halfway through, which our sources identify as false starts.
Oh yeah, we all do this. We think in real time, and our mouths often move faster than our structural planning. So someone will say, the original plan was.
Right. As a listener, you have to learn to mentally delete the abandoned grammar instantly and only process the correction.
Otherwise, you just get tangled in words that don't matter.
Right.
And then there's dislocation, or what linguists call heads and tails.
I was fascinated by the mechanics of heads and tails. It's basically a strategy for managing working memory during fast speech, right?
Yeah. So instead of saying that project is a total disaster, a speaker might put the topic at the very front to anchor it for the listener and then add the comment. So they'd say that project is a total disaster.
Oh, I do that all the time, actually.
We all do. Or they put it at the tail like it's a total disaster, that project.
It's not bad grammar. It's just a highly efficient way to manage information flow in a really fast-paced environment.
Exactly. It gives both the speaker and the listener a cognitive anchor while the rest of the sentence is being constructed live.
So since this conversational jazz is completely improvised and happening live, it seems basically impossible to train for it while you're just sitting at home studying alone. I mean, you can't just listen more, you have to listen differently.
Yes.
Which brings us to arguably the most counterintuitive part of the source material. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the sources claim that the ultimate hacks for advanced listening are actually reading and writing.
Which sounds completely backwards.
It totally does.
But to understand the illusion of speed in spoken English, you have to look at the blueprints. Let's look at the reading aspect first. The strategy is to read materials that explicitly dictate acoustic chaos.
Okay, like what?
Screenplays are perfect for this because they are literal instructions for how humans speak.
Right, like when you read a script for a sharp, fast-paced TV drama, you see the writer using parentheticals like beat to dictate a pregnant pause.
Exactly.
Or they use overlapping to show that two characters are actively interrupting each other. You see hyphens where a thought just trails off into nothing.
Yeah. By reading the blueprint, you train your brain to predict the acoustic chaos of real life before you even hear it. You essentially see how the magic trick is performed off stage.
You're visualizing the rhythm of the conversation.
Exactly. And the sources also detail a technique for reading dense journalism called the broadsheet autopsy, which targets a completely different kind of listening fatigue.
Okay, I actually tried this exercise after reading our sources, and it was so eye-opening.
Really? How did it go?
Well, the instructions say to take a paragraph from an elite publication, like say The Economist, right? And you grab a red and a blue highlighter.
Yeah.
You highlight the main subject and verb in red. That is the skeleton of the sentence. Then you highlight all the subordinate clauses, the adjectives, the hedging, basically all the extra stuff in blue. That is the flesh.
Right.
So I took a sentence that read something like, the central bank, facing unprecedented pressure from global markets over the last quarter, decided to aggressively raise interest rates.
And when you apply the highlighters to that sentence, the underlying mechanism just becomes totally obvious.
It does. The only red words were, the central bank decided to raise interest rates. Everything else was blue. It was shocking to see visually that like 70% of a highly complex sentence is just padding.
Yeah.
The core argument was completely buried under layers of flesh.
And doing that visually trains your brain to parse dense audio in real time. Because when a news anchor or a keynote speaker is talking at like 160 words per minute, your brain learns to ignore the blue flesh and lock instantly onto the red skeleton.
You stop trying to memorize every single adjective, and you just start tracking the structural core of the argument.
Exactly.
That visual mapping is incredibly helpful. But reading is only half of the equation here. The sources also talk about writing as the ultimate diagnostic mirror. They call it microtranscription.
Oh, this one is tough.
Yeah, they warn that it is a deeply humbling exercise for anyone who thinks they have great listening comprehension.
It is the most ruthless audit of your skills. The protocol is simple, but it's brutal. You take a 30-second audio clip of fast, authentic speech, no subtitles, no visual aids.
Okay.
And you write down every single word, every single sound, including the false starts and the mumbled filler words.
30 seconds sounds so short, but I imagine it takes forever.
It really does.
What happens mechanically when you do this is that the illusion of your listening comprehension just shatters. Because when you listen passively, your brain relies really heavily on context to autofill the gaps.
Right.
You think you heard the whole sentence, but you actually just hallucinated the grammar based on the context of the conversation.
Exactly. Writing forces you to confront the acoustic reality of what was actually spoken versus what you assumed you heard. It exposes what they call your phonetic blind spots.
Phonetic blind spots.
Yeah. Because of the specific phones present in your native language, there are certain linked sounds or reductions in English that your ear simply refuses to process.
The example that really got me was the word exactly. You know, you might write down exactly during the transcription, but when you go back and check the real transcript, you realize you completely missed that the speaker swallowed the C sound.
Right. They actually said exactly.
Exactly, yeah. Or you think you heard the textbook phrase, what are you going to do? But the acoustic truth vibrating in the air was actually what you're going to do.
Yeah, your brain was doing the autocorrect for you, which is a great survival mechanism normally. But in a second language, that autocorrect creates permanent blind spots.
So by forcing yourself to write down the phonetic reality of those mumbled blended sounds, you're forcing your neural pathways to acknowledge the acoustic truth of the language, not the textbook version it expects to hear.
It's like finding the dead zones in your hearing and forcing the brain to wire completely new connections. Just a few minutes a day of that transcription dissolves the wall of sound into crisp individual pieces of data.
Wow. So what does this all mean? We've gone from the buffering brain in a high-stakes meeting down into the negative space of sarcasm, through the chaotic jazz of spoken syntax, and finally to reverse engineering the blueprint through transcription and autopsies. What is the grand synthesis of all these sources?
I think the synthesis of all this material is really a profound shift in philosophy. Advanced listening is not an academic exercise of matching sound waves to dictionary definitions. It is fundamentally an act of deep empathy.
Empathy. That is a heavy word to apply to language learning, which is usually treated as a purely cognitive skill.
It is, but the mechanics of it demand empathy. When you move beyond the literal words, you are tuning into the frequency of another human being's mind. You are actively listening to their humor, their cultural background, their hesitations, and their unspoken fears.
Right.
And when you finally embrace the broken rules of spoken syntax and master the euphemisms that protect their social standing, you stop fighting the language. You transition from being a tourist in the English language, someone just visiting for the transaction of information, to becoming a resident.
You stop translating and you just start understanding. Becoming a resident of the language is a really beautiful way to frame it. But it leaves me with one final thing to mull over, and it builds right on that idea of the phonetic blind spots we just explored.
Okay, what is it?
Well, the sources mention that our native languages create these neurological blind spots, preventing us from hearing certain English sounds because our brains were never trained to value them. We literally can't hear what our native language hasn't conditioned us to hear.
Right.
But if mastering C1 English requires you to essentially rewire your brain to constantly scan for hidden emotional subtext, to detect sarcasm in a flat pitch, to notice the microexpressions in tone and the hesitation in a false start.
Yeah.
Does learning advanced English actually permanently change the way you hear the unspoken cues in your own native language?
Oh, wow. The cognitive overlap there is a fascinating area of linguistics.
Yeah.
And if you train your brain to become a highly sensitive acoustic radar in one language, you can't just turn that radar off.
Right. Does becoming an empathetic, hyper-aware listener in a second language make you a completely different kind of listener in your first? Something to think about next time you find yourself listening to the negative space.